we've got everybody in from the waiting room, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the National Aircraft Finance Association webinar, Bringing Title and Registration into the 21st Century. We've got a significant amount of content today, so we're going to get started pretty quickly. I'd like to start by just thanking you for taking the time to participate today. The National Aircraft Finance Association, by our mission, goal is to facilitate the interchange of ideas and capital that finance the world's aircraft. We do this through a combination of professional education, networking, and other industry outreach. And part of that is today's presentation, which will do a deep dive into changes that are coming to the FAA registry and other registries with which we work on a regular basis. So that said, I'd like to introduce our moderator today, Ford von Weisse. He's the Director and Head of Global Aircraft Finance for Citi Private Bank. Ford, welcome.
Great, Jim. Well, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody who's watching this webinar this afternoon. I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Debbie Mercer-Irwin, who is president of Wright Brothers Aircraft Title in Oklahoma City. We have Ed Kemmerer, who is a shareholder at Greenberg Taurig in Rhode Island. And many of you also know Scott McCreary, who is a shareholder at McAfee Taft, also in Oklahoma City. And also joining us is Jeff Towers, who is Vice President and General Counsel of TVPX from Concord, Massachusetts, where I am actually seated myself right now. The reason why we thought this would be a great webinar to deliver today is for two reasons. Number one, as many of you have heard, the GAO issued a recent report about the FAA. It touched upon a number of topics, which we'll get into in greater detail. And the FAA will be responding to that and introducing some changes. So it's important, particularly for the lending membership and the lenders in the crowd, to understand what those will be. While at the same time they were doing that, we, of course, hit the COVID crisis, and everybody started working from home and started using virtual tools, including DocuSign and other tools, which forced the FAA to respond, which they already actually had in some respects, and you'll hear more detail on that. But equally as important, forced us, the lenders, to begin to use some of those tools as well. And the question is how do those tools fit into what the FAA is doing? And we're going to first start off talking about the GAO report. It's important that we sort of set the stage and understand really what's going on in the background with the GAO and the registry in Oklahoma City. And we're going to start off with Scott McCreary, who's going to go over some of those changes. We'll be later joined by Debbie Irwin, who will fill in some of the more practical impacts of what the GAO has had to say. So, Scott?
Yeah, thank you, Ford. I'm assuming you can hear me?
Yes.
So just with a little background generally about, before we kind of jump into the GAO report, but a little background about the FAA and the aircraft registry itself, so that we're all on the same page. I mean, the FAA aircraft registry maintains registration and airworthiness information for U.S. registered aircraft. And right now there are over 300,000 civil aircraft registered with the FAA. The FAA aircraft registry here in the Mike Monroney Aeronautical Center, they register aircraft and they have certification of airman responsibilities. They keep in mind too that the registry, we're talking about civil aircraft, not drones. So there are also drones that are registered with the FAA. If they're 55 pounds or less, they're registered in a separate registry. And I believe there are over 1.5 million drones registered with the FAA right now also. So the FAA has a significant responsibility for maintaining those registrations and tracking the various information. Up until this point, historically, we have filed documents with the FAA kind of the old-fashioned way. It's really been your choices were to mail documents to the FAA through the post or express courier service, or mostly people would or often people would utilize local companies here in Oklahoma City like Debbie's and our firm to make filings with the FAA physically, because there are certain companies that have places out at the FAA public documents room, and we can deliver documents out there and facilitate filings of documents with the FAA through that public documents room. Of course, that's been complicated by the recent, by COVID and the recent changes that have been implemented by COVID. And in essence, basically what the FAA has done is that they have closed down our, at one point in time, they closed down our ability to file documents at all through the public documents room, but that's been opened back up. And we're now able to submit documents through the public documents room, but it's not quite as efficient as it used to be. And Debbie, I think you've got some information, some thoughts on that.
Yeah, they pick up from the bin every hour, where before we would go to the window, it would be that minute that they receive the documents. So we know if we put our documents in the box at 12:30, they won't be picked up by an FAA employee until 1. So the hours of that box is from 7:30 to 3:30 for pickup, I believe.
Right, and I think that right now you can submit documents again through filing through the public documents room out at the FAA, but there's a delay in how those documents are processed. So we basically used to be able to go to the public documents room window, hand documents to the FAA. They would file stamp them and hand the documents back to us, and we would have immediate filing times and filing stamps that related to those documents. And now, as Debbie said, our choices are to submit the documents by placing them in bins outside the public documents room. And so there's an inherent delay in how fast the FAA picks up the documents out of the bins and then takes them through their systems, file stamps them, and gets the documents back to us. And Debbie, I think there are 2 bins out there. I think there's a bin for priorities and a bin for non-priority filings.
Mm-hmm.
I think the FAA picks up the priority filing bin every 30 minutes, and then the non-priority bin, just, I'm not sure there's a set time, but it's not a 30-minute cycle.
Yeah, it's supposed to be every hour is what we've been told, but I don't know if it's on perfect cycle or not.
Right. And so as part of that, and part of the changes, that were implemented at the FAA because of COVID, they have opened up the ability to file documents by email or electronically now. They're kind of restricted in a way because the technology that they have at the FAA is very old and doesn't really support efficient electronic processing of documents, but there is an ability now to file documents electronically. Debbie, how is your company seeing electronic filings? How have you worked with those?
It's working out very well. When we file electronically, through the email there you have on the slide, that we get the filing time as our email when we send them. That's what we're using as a filing time. And it still is a little bit of a slower process, but it does work out well. If you have DocuSign documents or digitally signed documents, we can file them electronically with the FAA, but they can't be if they're ink signed. Ink signed documents have to go in the bins.
Right. And as Debbie indicated, so when as we do a lot of filings, it's actually, from our perspective, just mechanically getting the closings done and working with, banks like Ford's and other entities. It's a lot easier for us if parties do have documents digitally executed, even if we don't email the documents to the FAA, even if we don't file that way. it's certainly much easier for us if they're digitally executed in many instances, because we're not waiting on filing time, or we're not waiting on original courier packages to arrive every morning, and we're not getting documents that someone thought they had sent us the originals, but they really sent us copies. It just eliminates a lot of issues if parties have digitally executed the documents.
And Scott, it's Ford. I think we're going to get into what digitally executing documents is all about a little later with Ed. So for all the folks, the viewers out there, don't worry, we'll get to that.
Exactly. So a couple of the, so we've actually found that on occasion that filing documents electronically, actually emailing to them to the FAA, certainly is helpful, especially at times when the FAA might be closed, or it's, our offices might be closed either for COVID or ice storms or what have you. And so the ability to file documents by email is, we don't use it all the time, but on occasion we do use it. People need to understand and remember that if we place the documents in the bin out at the FAA, or if we email the documents in to the FAA, they're not officially filed until the FAA takes those documents, processes them, and file stamps them. So for perfection purposes, for lenders and perfecting their interest in aircraft, you really are not perfected until the FAA takes that PDF that you emailed in, prints it off, processes it, does it, whatever they do internally, and file stamps the document. So the submission of the documents, again, through the bins or through email, is not the same thing as them being officially filed for perfection purposes. And it also can be problematic from a closing perspective if we're emailing documents in to obtain IR codes and things like that that are needed to follow up with the IR registrations on a transaction. That said, the FAA has issued an opinion. The FAA Counsel's Office has issued an opinion that confirms, for purposes of operating an aircraft on the duplicate copy of the aircraft registration application, which works in instances where you've submitted the bill of sale and the application to the FAA by email, or by filing in the bin at the FAA, or placing it in the mail, that if you put the bill of sale and the application in, if you submitted it through the mail, email, or placing it in the bin at the FAA, that is sufficient for purposes of what we call the mailbox rule, which is not exactly a mailbox rule, but it is, the FAA takes the position that if you submitted the bill of sale and the application with the FAA, that you have authority to operate on the copy of that application. And so we have been able to obtain an opinion from the FAA that it doesn't have to be file stamped. The application and the bill of sale don't have to be file stamped, they just have to be submitted. And so what does that mean? So it's often helpful if we close on a weekend or at the end of the day and the parties miss the filing window, but they still want to operate the aircraft, they still want to fly the aircraft off, then it's possible we can submit the documents by email or placing them in the post, and that flight would be valid on a copy of the aircraft registration application. It doesn't mean that the parties are perfected for notice purposes, or that a lender's perfected. So one other thing we've seen, Debbie, and I don't know what your experience has been, but we've seen with the electronic filings and COVID and all of this, we've seen an increase in parties utilizing prospective international interest registrations. And so it's basically the uncertainty of knowing whether or not you can file documents with the FAA, or knowing how quickly you can get the file stamped copy back from the FAA to know you're perfected. Parties have tended to try to mitigate that by making prospective international registry registrations.
Yes, that's worked out very well.
Yeah.
In those circumstances, when you don't know if you're going to get the information back in time to go ahead and do the prospective filings.
And keep in mind that if you do prospective interest registrations, and if it's a US registered aircraft, you do have to follow up and file the documents that support those registrations with the FAA within 60 days. So you get your prospective registration, your code, but you have to file up or follow up and file the actual documents with the FAA within 60 days.